Welcome. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak at this conference. My name is Paul Segerstrom. I'm a professor at Stockholm School of Economics. And at that school, I teach in the bachelor program, one of the 300 student classes on international economics. So every student that has gone through the Stockholm School of Economics bachelor program has had me as a teacher since the year 2000. And I also teach at the master level. And what I'm going to talk about today is actually slides taken from my master course on international economics. Yeah, so I thought I would give you a flavor of what we are covering at the Stockholm School of Economics. It might surprise you a little bit to see what type of material is actually being taught at the school. The subject is Christianity, the roots of Europe and the Western world. Adam Smith is widely regarded as the founding father of economics. And in his book, The Wealth of Nations from 1776, the main focus is on explaining why some countries are rich and other countries are poor. The question is, what's the best explanation today? In particular, why did free markets first appear in the West? And more generally, why did the West become so economically prosperous compared to all other regions in the world? A few years ago, I spent some time looking into this issue. And my plan was, I was going to read all the significant books explaining why some countries are rich and other countries are poor, and evaluate who has the best explanation. And I did this. We have plenty of time for research at the Stockholm School of Economics. And I found a book by Niall Ferguson called Civilization, the West and the Rest, had the most impressive explanation, consistent with what I've learned from spending decades studying and doing research in economics. His book, published in, Niall Ferguson, by the way, is a history professor at Harvard University, so he's very distinguished. Has the author of many books. This particular book, the message, a bit oversimplified, but the message communicated in a few words is that more competition contributes to economic prosperity, more science contributes to economic prosperity, more private property contributes to economic prosperity. The first 3 chapters in the book have these themes, and he goes on. I'm oversimplifying, but that's the core message, that these are really important issues if you're thinking about why some countries are rich and other countries are poor. He also has a second message in the book, and that is that religious beliefs do influence economic outcomes. And my master course, I have designed it around this message in Niall Ferguson's book. In my course, I want to show students that these ideas are not just political propaganda. You can actually derive these messages as results of well-specified economic models with standard assumptions and strong empirical support. So more science contributes to economic prosperity. In the course, I present a model of growth and trade where symmetric trade liberalization, that's a symmetric reduction in trade barriers between countries, leads to more research and development, more innovation, and higher long-run consumer welfare. It's not just political propaganda. You really can show this from a well-formulated economic model with standard assumptions and lots of empirical support for this message. More private property contributes to economic prosperity. I do this by presenting in the course a model of intellectual property rights where, within the model, stronger protection of private property leads to more technology transfer to poor countries, actually, more research and development employment, more innovation, and higher long-run consumer welfare in poor countries. So my message is these countries should be strengthening their intellectual property rights if they want to get good outcomes in the long run. Again, it's not just political propaganda. You can get it from a well-specified economic model. And then the third message, more competition contributes to economic prosperity. I present the Melitz model, which is the currently most influential model of international trade, has this implication. In this Melitz model, symmetric trade liberalization, that's a general reduction in trade barriers between symmetric countries, leads to more competition in every industry, higher industrial productivity, and higher consumer welfare. Okay, that's the first part. And then the other part of Niall Ferguson's message in his book is that religious beliefs are important. So I've wrestled with the issue, how do you communicate that in the secular academic environment? Religious beliefs really are important. Here's what I come up with, a way of explaining it to students. Suppose the dominant religion in region A teaches that private property is good, that God approves of private property. Suppose the dominant religion in region B teaches that private property is bad, associated with selfishness, that all property should be publicly owned. Then, other things being equal, region A is going to become much more prosperous than region B in the long run, or eventually. Region A has a development promoting religion, whereas region B has a development retarding religion, to use the terminology in this book by development economist Lawrence Harrison, published in 2006. And I really like this terminology that Harrison came up with. Development promoting religion, development retarding religion. And for the region A, I'm thinking of, I don't say it in the slides, but I'm thinking of Christianity. This is what the Bible teaches, respect for private property. And for the dominant religion in region B, I'm not actually mentioning it in the slides, but I'm thinking of Marxism, life in the Soviet Union under Lenin and Stalin, or in China under Mao, where private property was abolished and the economic outcome was really bad. Really bad. Shockingly bad. Okay, back to Niall Ferguson. I thought today I would, well, this is part of my lectures I give at Stockholm School of Economics. I'd read a little bit from Niall Ferguson. I think he has really important points, and I want to give you a little bit of a flavor of what he is saying in his book. And maybe it will whet your appetite so you go out and buy the book and read it yourself and see more of what he is actually saying. And I'm going to talk about the scientific revolution because I I don't think many people understand what really happened and why. Scientific revolution that happened in Europe, and I'm just quoting from his book, reading an excerpt, is perhaps best illustrated by a list of important breakthroughs. In 1543, Nicholas Copernicus stated the heliocentric theory of the solar system. For the first time, he placed the sun at the center of the solar system in his theory of planetary motion. Tycho Brahe recorded the first European observation of a supernova in 1572. Galileo in 1589, his tests of falling bodies revolutionized the empirical method. Gilbert describes the magnetic properties of the Earth and electricity in the year 1600. 1608, that's not showing up.
I think you need to jump to the next slide.
Maybe. Well, we lost that. I'll skip him. Galileo discovers 4 of Jupiter's moons in 1610 and infers that the Earth is not at the center of the universe. Paul Napier introduces logarithms in 1614. By the way, in my course, the first 5 lectures are just pure mathematics. I go through integrals, differential equations, optimal control theory, laying the foundation for presenting these economic models I've just talked about. And logarithms are really important to the analysis. Economists use logarithms a lot. Harvey describes the circulation of blood. René Descartes founds analytic geometry, which we're using all the time in the course. Fermat and Pascal found probability theory, which we're using extensively when we get into these economic models. Robert Boyle defines elements in chemical analysis in 1661. Isaac Newton in 1669 presents the first systematic account of calculus, which was independently discovered by Gottfried Leibniz. And well, in the course, I'm using calculus all the time in my lectures. Derivatives, integrals, differential equations. It all goes back to Leibniz and Newton, the big discoveries. And I might add, this is the most useful mathematics that has ever been invented. Leibniz, I would argue, is the greatest mathematician of all time. And he's not a recent thinker. Okay, keep on going on. Those who decry Eurocentrism as if it were some distasteful prejudice have a problem. The scientific revolution was, by any scientific measure, wholly Eurocentric. An astonishingly high proportion of the key figures, around 80%, originated in a hexagon bounded by Glasgow, Copenhagen, Krakow, Naples, Marseille, and Plymouth. And nearly all the rest were born within 100 miles of that area. In contrast, Ottoman scientific progress was non-existent in this same time period. The best explanation for this divergence, Niall Ferguson writes, was the unlimited sovereignty of religion in the Muslim world. Toward the end of the 11th century, influential Islamic clerics began to argue that the study of Greek philosophy was incompatible with the teachings of the Quran. Islam holds that the universe is inherently irrational, that there is no cause and effect, because everything happens as a direct result of Allah's will at that particular time. So anything is possible. attempts at science then are not only foolish, but they're actually blasphemous in that they imply limits to Allah's power and authority. And we see this working out in history. The prominent Sufi scholar Al-Ghazali, dating back to 1055 to 1111, said, "It is rare that someone becomes absorbed in this foreign science without renouncing religion and letting go of the reins of piety within him." He added that killing infidels was obligatory of all good Muslims. Under clerical influence, the study of ancient philosophy, and this is what science emerged out of, was curtailed, books burned, and so-called free thinkers persecuted. In 1485, the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, by the way, I visited his palace in present-day Turkey, Istanbul, so you can go and you can see it. You can see exactly where he lived. And Caliphate of Islam, he outlawed the printing press. In 1515, a decree of this Sultan Selman I threatened with death anyone found using a printing press. And so Niall Ferguson writes, "This failure to reconcile Islam with scientific progress was to prove disastrous. If the scientific revolution was generated by a network, then the Ottoman Empire was effectively offline. The only Western book translated into a Middle Eastern language until the late 1700s was a medical book on the treatment of syphilis." That's it. Some Ottomans came to realize that they needed to learn from the West. For example, in 1732, an Ottoman official wrote a book that was presented to Sultan Mahmud I, in which he says, why do Christian nations, which were so weak in the past compared to Muslim nations, begin to dominate so many lands in the modern times and even defeat the once victorious Ottoman armies? The message of his book was clear. The Ottoman Empire has to embrace both the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment if it was to be credible as a world power. But to describe the superiority of European governments was one thing. To actually implement reforms of the Ottoman system was quite another. Time again, attempts at change fell foul to political opposition. They really never did implement serious reform in a successful way. Okay, let me talk a little bit about the Enlightenment and Science. I leave Niall Ferguson now. Gave you a taste of his book. I'm going to switch to Rodney Stark, another scholar, in his book, How the West Won, published in 2014. Very interesting book. This is what he says. This is what he does. He identified all the significant scientific stars of the era, beginning with the publication of Copernicus's book in 1543, that placed the sun at the center of the solar system, which was a major breakthrough conceptually. And including all born prior to 1680, this yielded a data set consisting of 52 star scientists. 52 star scientists associated with what we call the scientific revolution. And I look at the list, and it's very reasonable looking. Number 3 is Robert Boyle. Number 8, René Descartes. Galileo is there. Kepler, Leibniz, Isaac Newton. You look at the list, there's nothing fishy going on. These really are the great scientists associated with the scientific revolution. Okay? Then, what Stark does is he studies biographical information that's available on every one of these 52 scientists, codes each star scientist according to their personal piety. To code someone as devout, Stark required clear evidence of especially deep religious involvement. For example, the great chemist Robert Boyle, he spent a great deal of money on translations of the Bible into non-Western languages. So you'd say, oh, that's a devout person. Okay? Stark used the code conventionally religious to identify those whose biography offers no evidence of skepticism, but whose piety does not stand out as other than satisfactory to their associates. And finally, he reserves the label skeptic for anyone about whom he could infer disbelief or at least profound doubt in the existence of a conscious God. Only one of the 52 qualified. Edmund Halley, he was rejected for a professorship at Oxford University on account of his atheism. Okay? One. Here's the results in a table. Devout, 31 of them, 60% of the star scientists are categorized as devoutly religious. Conventional, 38%. Skeptic, 2%. And why is this going on? It is only because Europeans believed in God as the intelligent designer of a rational universe that they pursued the secrets of creation. And don't take my word for it, just listen to Johannes Kepler. He is the physicist who first came to realize that planets don't move in circles, they move in ellipses. That is a big conceptual breakthrough in physics. All of a sudden, things made a lot more sense when it comes to planetary motion. This is what Kepler states. The chief aim of all investigations of the external world should be to discover the rational order and harmony imposed on it by God, and which he revealed to us in the language of mathematics. I really like this because in my course, the first five lectures are just pure mathematics. So you see the earlier motivation for paying attention to mathematics. In his last will and testament, the great chemist Robert Boyle wished the members of the Royal Society of London continued success in their, quote, laudable attempts to discover the true nature of the works of God. Listen to this. One of the 52 star scientists, Gottfried Leibniz, he's the inventor of calculus. My first lecture in the course is about integral calculus. The whole lecture is about the inventions of Leibniz, and arguably the greatest mathematician of all time, because he invented calculus. He even developed a new argument for the existence of God.
Right. The right cross.
Right cross. Now, can you help me? I'm a Mac user, so I'm getting confused here. Good. Yeah. Leibniz asked what I think is a very good question. Why is there something rather than nothing? And this led him to what philosophers today, modern philosophers, call the Leibniz cosmological argument. And I really like this argument because this is the greatest mathematician of all time. If you don't like the reasoning, maybe there's something wrong. Goes like this. First premise, everything that exists has an explanation of its existence. Second premise, if the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is God. Third premise, the universe exists. And then Leibniz noticed this. Therefore, from premise 1 and premise 3, once you accept those premises, it logically follows the universe has an explanation of its existence. And therefore, from premise 2 and premise 4, the explanation of the existence of the universe is God. So in other words, if you're going to reject this argument, one of these first three premises you have to reject. The question is, which one? You reject the idea that the universe exists? Any takers? Premise 2, a logically equivalent statement to premise 2 is standard fare in books advocating atheism. So you want to reject that? That leaves premise 1. And if you reject that, you don't look very scientific. You don't belong in the academic world if you reject premise 1, in my opinion. Not thinking in a scientific way. That's his argument for the existence of God. Okay, looking at history, we find that a biblically inspired confidence in the mathematical structure of the universe came first, before any actual scientific discoveries. Mathematician Morris Klein writes, quote, "The early mathematicians were sure of the existence of mathematical laws underlying natural phenomena and persisted in the search for them because they were convinced a priori that God had incorporated them in the construction of the universe. People must first be convinced that there is a mathematical order in nature, otherwise they will not go searching for it, and science will not get off the ground." Okay, I'm going to leave Rodney Stark's book. I hope that whets your appetite for reading more. Let me return to what I started off with. The currently most influential book among economists about why some countries are rich and other countries are poor is actually not Niall Ferguson in his book Civilization, the West and the Rest. It's a book I like, but it's not the currently most influential book. I would say, based on my experience, in particular my experience at Stockholm School of Economics, talking with other professors, supervising student master theses and other activities, is a book by Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson is the most influential book right now among the professional economists. It's called Why Nations Fail. You can go to any large bookstore and you can buy this book. It's been a bestseller among economics books for the general public. Darren Acemoglu is a star economics professor at MIT. Robinson was a political science professor at Harvard. He has recently moved to University of Chicago. Very distinguished people. And the core message of this book, again, I'm oversimplifying slightly, but it goes like this. Inclusive political institutions contribute to economic prosperity. Inclusive political institutions, we're thinking democratic institutions, institutions where people get to vote, where a lot of people have a say in decision making, that's good, according to Acemoglu and Robinson. The countries that are poor are the countries that don't have these inclusive political institutions. And according to them, this is most of what's going on in the world today. Religious beliefs do not influence economic outcomes. So in your analysis, in their analysis, they basically ignore everything to do with religion. It's just clutter, you leave religion out of the story and there's less distracting detail, is their reasoning. And they have empirical work to justify this. In fact, it's all based on empirical work. I don't think that their argument is so impressive. By the way, James Robinson, he actually, a few years ago, he came to the Stockholm School of Economics and gave a special lecture, the Heckscher lecture, annual lecture at the school. And I went to that lecture. It was very interesting to see him talk. It was about this book, Why Nations Fail. The main auditorium at the Stockholm School of Economics was just packed, filled with people. It was the best attended Heckscher lecture I've ever seen. Lots of students were interested in hearing him talk about why nations fail. And that reflects the high level of influence that these ideas have among economists today. Okay. But I'm not impressed, and right now I want to tell you what's wrong with this book, why I think Ferguson has a better explanation. What's wrong with Acemoglu and Robinson's book? I don't think many people know. So it's worth going into these topics of what's wrong with it. I don't think many people know. I think what's wrong with it is the second part of his claim. Religious beliefs do not influence economic outcomes. And that claim is based on empirical work. But I've taken a close look at that empirical work. I've put it under the microscope, so to speak, and it doesn't hold up under careful scrutiny. It's not as impressive as it seems on the surface. And because this empirical work is flawed, the first claim, inclusive political institutions contribute to economic prosperity, I look at what he's done and I think he's correct. I think that inclusive political institutions are a good thing. They really do contribute to economic prosperity. But at the same time, I step back and say, these guys, they haven't really established that in a convincing way. Their empirical work is flawed. So even the first step, I'd say, hasn't been properly established, although I think they are correct in their causation. And I want to explain now why. A remarkable paper was published in the American Political Science Review in 2012. American Political Science Review is the #1 journal in political science. So this is the best place to publish for academic research in political science. By author Robert Woodbury, and this paper won a Best Article Award. So it's not just published in the top journal, but it wins a 2013 Best Article Award for that journal. In this paper, Woodbury demonstrates historically and statistically that conversionary Protestants, what he refers to as CPs for short, heavily influenced the rise and spread of stable democracy around the world. And this is highly relevant because remember, Acemoglu and Robinson are talking about inclusive political institutions. They're talking about stable democracy. For them, democracy is good. Dictatorship is bad. Woodbury writes, I just reproduced some of his quotes to give you some flavor of what he's saying, and then I'll take you to the results. He writes, CPs, conversionary Protestants, were a crucial catalyst initiating the development and spread of religious liberty, mass education, mass printing, newspapers, voluntary organizations, and colonial reforms, thereby creating the conditions that made stable democracy more likely. Statistically, the historical prevalence of Protestant missionaries explains about half the variation in democracy in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and Oceania. By the way, Oceania, I was wondering, what is that? It's Australia, New Zealand, area around there. It may not be a common term, but that's what he's referring to. And removes the impact of most variables that dominate current statistical research about democracy. The association between Protestant missions and democracy is consistent in different continents and subsamples, and is robust to more than 50 controls and to instrumental variable analysis. There's a lot of robustness checks in this paper, and the results just never go away. No matter how you try to rearrange the data, the core results just stick there in a striking way. They don't go away. Woodbury focuses on conversionary Protestants because they actively attempt to persuade others of their beliefs. They emphasize the importance of everyone reading the Bible, and they believe that grace/faith/choice saves people, not group membership or sacraments. For conversionary Protestants, everyone needs to read the Bible, not just elites. Therefore, everyone needs to read, including women and the poor. And you may say these are trivial things, but these conversionary Protestants are going to countries where no one knows how to read anything, countries that are 100% illiterate. And they're teaching everyone, even women and the poor. Furthermore, conversionary Protestants expect ordinary people to make their own religious choices. They believe that people are saved through true faith in God, thus each individual has to decide which faith to follow. Okay, I'm getting a little bit short on time, so I think I'm going to jump to the results. They're really stunning. By the way, a show of hands, how many of you have ever seen this before? Not many. That's good. That's good. Covering something new in this talk today. Okay, so I'm going to jump to the results. Try to get them showing up. Yes. Yeah. This is the column 1 in this table is the main result in the paper presented in the simplest possible way. I'm going to try to talk through exactly what's going on here. So even those of you in this audience that have never had a course in statistics hopefully can follow some of what's happening in this picture. It's a robust regression predicting democracy in the non-West. So what Woodbury has is he has data on 130 countries in the world, and they're all the countries in the world except for the West, except for countries in Western Europe, like Sweden, and Germany, and France, and except the US and Canada. You know, take those countries out of the picture, let's focus in on everyone else. Okay. Actually, it's 140 countries. So down here, and for number of countries, 140. So 140 non-Western countries. That's most of the countries in the world are being studied in this regression. He's running a regression where the left-hand side variable is the mean level of democracy in a country between 1950 and 1994. The reason so he has a measure of degree of democracy for every country and every year. He's taking the mean to pick up the extent to which countries have stable democracy, democratic institutions that persist over time. It's one thing to have a country where there's an election once, and that's it. Whoever wins rules from then on as a dictator. We wouldn't say that's stable democracy. So, for example, Adolf Hitler, he was a democratically elected leader in 1933. One election, well, that was it. That was the end of elections in Germany. So the whole point in studying mean level of democracy is to free us of the idea that Nazi Germany had democratic institutions, for example. Okay? So this is what we're trying to explain. The degree to which countries have stable democracy after 1950. That's the left-hand side variable in the regression. Column 1 is the full sample. On the right-hand side of the regression, Woodbury has variables measuring the presence of Protestant missionaries in each of these 140 countries. So, first variable on the list, right here, is years exposure to Protestant missions. So he's looking at a country and he's saying, for how many years have Protestant missionaries been working in this country? So, for example, if you take the country of Namibia in Africa, I know that in one part of Namibia, Ovambo land, Protestant missionaries first showed up in the year 1870. Maybe they showed up a little earlier in other parts of Namibia, but these are the types of calculations that are done here. Just identifying what is the first year they showed up, how long have they been present in a country. It's a measure of the extent to which Protestant missionaries are influencing in that country. Second variable, Protestant missionaries per 10,000 population in the year 1923. So just how many of them are there relative to population size. He has that information for every one of those 140 countries. And then the third variable is percent evangelized by the year 1900. What percentage of people have actually heard the Christian message? It's a measure of the extent to which these Protestant missionaries are working hard, actually getting the message out. I mean, you could go to a country and you don't talk to anyone, nobody hears. And notice, those are the only three right-hand side variables in regression 1. And notice that the estimated coefficients on each of these variables, they're all positive. So for a year's exposure to Protestant missions, it's 0.16, plus 0.16 is the estimated coefficient. And the 3 stars means that number is statistically significant at the 1/10 of 1% level. It's very strongly statistically significant, meaning more years exposed to Protestant missions earlier in time makes it more likely that a country has democratic institutions later on in time. The second one, Protestant missions per 10,000 population in the year 1923. Notice the coefficient, 4.42, very positive. 3 stars, statistically significant at the 1/10 of 1% level. Very strong statistical significance and positive. What that means is if there are more Protestant missionaries present in 1923 in a country, relative to population size, the more there are, the more likely the country has democratic institutions late after 1950. So many, many years later, you're picking up the effects of these Protestant missionaries. Third variable, percent evangelized by 1900. The coefficient, 0.28, again, 3 stars, statistically significant at the 1/10 of 1% level, and positive. So more evangelized, more likely to have democratic institutions later in time. And then go down the column to the very bottom, the R-square from robust regression, it's 0.498. That means roughly 50% of the variation in democratic institutions later in time is explained by earlier presence of Protestant missionaries. It's just stunning. It's just, for me, this just, it just amazed me that that R-square is so high. And that all 3 variables measuring Protestant missions are very positive, statistically significant. They're explaining so much of the variation in the data. Okay, this is Woodbury's main result. Now I want to use that result to criticize Acemoglu and Robinson. So let me tell you what Acemoglu and Robinson do in their empirical work. The empirical work claiming that religion doesn't matter. Okay? What they do, they have a variable called settler mortality rate. In an article they wrote, published in the American Economic Review in 2001, top economics journal. And they make the argument, if the settler mortality rate is high, when Europeans come to a place like Namibia, settler mortality rate is high. That means Europeans tend to die quickly. If that's the case, not many Europeans choose to come. Why would you want to move to a place where you die quickly?
Yeah. Don't go there.
That's the idea. So if the settler mortality rate is low, lots of Europeans show up, and they bring their European-style institutions with them, including inclusive political institutions. If the settler mortality rate is high, few Europeans show up. Those that do say to themselves, well, instead of having European institutions here, let's run an economy based on slave labor and make a lot of money. Yeah, that's the story. So this settler mortality rate, they argue, is a very good instrument for, gives you exogenous variation in institutions. Okay, so what Woodbury does is he adds that settler mortality rate variable to his regression. See how well it does. And one problem with the settler mortality rate variable is we only have this data for n equals 57 countries. Whereas Woodbury's data is for 140 countries. Now that's not a problem with Woodbury's analysis, that's a limitation of the data connected with settler mortality. So in column 2, Woodbury runs the same regression, but on the data of 57 countries where we have this settler mortality rate data. And you can see that the results are still basically the same for the missionary variables, but they're not as statistically significant. The results are still there, but they're weaker, and it's natural they're weaker because there's less data. Harder to get strong statistical significance when you have just a small number of countries that you're doing your statistical analysis based on. Okay, but anyway, that's column 2, the reduced sample results. And then column 3 is he runs the regression where he has the missionary variables included, and he adds on the settler mortality rate variable, which Acemoglu and Robinson are claiming, well, this is really important. And what do you notice? The settler mortality rate variable, the estimated coefficient, 0.001, it's really small, and there's no stars there. It's not statistically significant at the 5% level, at the 10% level, let alone at the 1/10 of 1% level. It's not, the standard error is below 0.005. The standard error is 5 times the estimate. You're not even close to statistical significance. So I look at these results and I say, once you control for the presence of Protestant missionaries in a country, this settler mortality rate variable, it doesn't explain anything. 0. Nothing survives their empirical work. Once you take into account the presence of the Protestant missionaries, it doesn't matter whether the disease environment is really bad, whether the country has malaria or yellow fever or not. It just doesn't matter at all. All that matters is how many Protestant missionaries happen to be showing up. And in Acemoglu and Robinson's empirical work, this settler mortality rate variable is an instrument. It's supposed to pick up exogenous variation in institutions across countries. I look at column 3 regression, and I say, well, it's not a valid instrument. It doesn't satisfy the relevance requirement for a valid instrument, so none of the theorems and statistics apply. They're not doing anything that is scientifically valid using this instrument for exogenous variation in institutions. They're just running garbage regressions. Good. Let me show you one other piece of evidence. Find it. Here it is. Here it is. This is also from the same paper by Woodbury. It's robust regression predicting democracy in the non-West, in non-West countries, with the mean level of democracy from 1950 to 1994 as the left-hand side variable. That's what you're trying to explain. variations in the extent to which countries have stable democratic institutions. And what Woodbury does is, for right-hand side variables, he does things like adds a dummy variable for whether a country is a former British colony, former Dutch colony, that's another right-hand side variable. Economists are really big on geography variables and for explaining institutions. So he has the country's latitude as a right-hand side variable. He controls for geography. Whether it's an island nation, like the UK, maybe there's some advantages to being on an island. Whether it's a landlocked nation, maybe there's some disadvantages associated with that. That's a right-hand side variable. Percent European in 1980, maybe there's some benefits if there's just more Europeans in the country later on in time. That might help with the development of democratic institutions. Percent Muslim in 1980, it's an attempt to control for the later presence of Muslims. Maybe that has a positive or a negative impact on whether democratic institutions developed in the country. Plus a bunch of other, I'm having more problems here. Wish I had my Macintosh. Anyway, good, we're back in order. So you can see he's adding a bunch of variables that the earlier literature on where does democracy come from thought was important. And when you run the regression, some of these variables turn out to be statistically significant. You can see the stars. You can see, for example, 2 stars for British colony. There's an extensive literature discussing why countries that are former British colonies tend to be more likely to have democratic institutions later in time. And people puzzle, why is that? Is there something special about the British legal system, for example? Okay, you run the regression. Some of the variables show up as statistically significant, positive or negative. You run the regression again, that's column 2, adding on the 3 Protestant missionary variables. What do you get? All 3 of them are statistically significant, positive. That's good news for Woodbury. Nothing else is. All the other numbers cease to be statistically significant. So it seems in column 1 that these variables are important, but once you control for Protestant missions, you realize none of this other stuff is important. None of the geographies variables matter. It doesn't matter how many Muslims there are or how many Europeans there are. This is really powerful evidence that it's the Protestant missionaries that are making the difference. Okay, I close with one last slide. Go to the end. Yeah, this is from Harrison's book that I mentioned earlier, the development economist, Lawrence Harrison. And it's a table in the book, and seeing this table really inspired me to look more deeply at the issues that I've talked about today. So this was information that hit me early on to say, boy, I need to take religion more seriously in explaining economic outcomes. What Harrison does is he takes all the countries in the world, looking at the year 2002, and he groups them based on what is the historically dominant religion. So for Protestant Christianity, he includes countries like the United States, Germany, Sweden, United Kingdom. In 2002, all these nations combined represented 530 million people. And then looking at all these countries combined, he looks at average income, per capita gross domestic product, standard measure of income per person that economists use is $29,000 per person. Does the same thing for other religions. For Catholic, that's countries like France, Italy, Spain, Brazil, we're talking about 904 million people. Average income, 9,358. And you can just go down the column. What hit me was just how much variation there was in the average income. If you group countries based on historically dominant religion, I just was not expecting the numbers to be so different. With Protestant Christianity on top. And I was particularly struck by the difference between Protestant and Islam. $29,000 versus $3,000. That's a factor 10 difference. The average person living in a country where Protestant Christianity is the historically dominant religion has an income that is 10 times as large as the average person living in a country where Islam is the historically dominant religion. I was just, wow, didn't realize that was the case. One doesn't see this table in any economics textbook. But once you see this table, you start having doubts about this idea that religious beliefs don't matter for economic outcomes. Sure looks like they might matter. And I've just presented evidence that they really do matter. That's it for today.